Standing at the counter waiting seemed like a chore in itself. She grew bored. The nurse that had told her to wait here a moment had been gone for almost 15 minutes. Lena was the name her tag sported. It fit her, and Frankie couldn't help but wonder who thought of it. A very pretty name. A small breeze from an oscillating fan, no more than 10 inches tall, waved red ribbons from its face as it cooled a small area in the nurse's station. What was taking so long? The last time she was here, it was the chipper nurse at the front desk. She'd taken her straight back to see the Ingrams. This nurse was different. Not as chipper, and had for some reason gone back to speak to someone about her visit. Frankie was growing impatient. Too many shadows in this place. She was uncomfortable and confused. What was going on, she thought to herself, nearly mouthing the words. When the nurse finally re-emerged, it had been nearly 20 minutes, and she scuttled down the long corridor with her stout, chubby legs that seemed to be attached directly to her feet, like someone had forgotten to give her ankles. The thick, portly hips and legs stood out on the woman because it didn't fit with the rest of her rather small, slender frame. It looked almost like two halves of two separate women had been stacked together. She was an older woman, perhaps late 40s, early 50s. She looked worn and tired. Her light brown hair frizzed out of its trappings on both sides, with slight hints of gray showing itself as she passed beneath the fluorescent lights. Her mouth curled downward involuntarily on her pale, passionless face, as though her years and experiences had prevented her from smiling. Frankie could only imagine. This woman in her years of employment at this home must have seen so much death. "Miss Welch, I'm so sorry to have kept you waiting," she said impersonally. "You said you were here to see the Ingrams?" The nurse asked, showing slight hints of confusion in her near expressionless features. "And you say you were here last week and spoke to them?" Yes," Frankie replied. The nurse now looked at her uncertainly, rubbing her fingers along the breadth of her forehead, as though she were looking for some appropriate way to say something. Can you... She trailed off for a moment. "Can you describe the nurse here at the desk when you came last week, ma'am?" Frankie scratched her head then, trying to recall the nurse's features. She was quite a bit taller than me, maybe 5'8" or so," she began. "She had sort of pinched features, dishwater hair about shoulder length, maybe early 20s, a very chipper, cheerful disposition." The nurse was taken aback by the description. "Do you remember her name?" Lena closed her eyes tight then, as though anticipating some ghoul to jump out at her. Frankie grew concerned. "Ma'am, I'm only here to see the Ingrams. May I please..." Lena shot her eyes open and cut her off before she could finish. "Please, Miss Welch, do you remember the nurse's name?" Frankie stared for a moment at her before responding. Lena looked genuinely worried, but she couldn't understand why. What was going on, she wondered. Natalie. Frankie watched, unsure of the situation, as the older woman's shoulders slumped, and she could gauge the moment that her heart sank. The air in the room seemed somehow different now, thick and heavy, like a wool blanket had been wet down and cast over the entire place. Lena's eyes pinched shut the moment Frankie spoke the nurse's name. With a heaving sigh, she opened her eyes and looked at Frankie with a confused and tired expression. "Please, Miss Welch, would you sit a moment?" Lena asked gently as she gestured to the pair of armchairs in the waiting room near the front desk. A small fake ficus stood between them, not big enough to block the face of the concerned nurse sitting beside her, but enough to make itself known, and enough to be irritating. As they sat, Lena looked down to the floor and stayed quiet for a moment, picking her fingernails in a nervous gesture. Without looking up, she began to speak quietly, so much so that Frankie barely heard her. Natalie Harris started working here at the home nearly 15 years ago. Frankie grew confused at that moment. Natalie looked just a few years out of 20 last week. If that were true, she would have begun work here only as a child. This made no sense, but when Frankie opened her mouth to speak, she was immediately met with Lena's eyes. "Let me finish," she told her with the most serious tone she had ever heard. Natalie took care of the Ingrams herself. She insisted on it. Her shift was 12 hours, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., 4 days a week. She always worked hard, and she was an absolute joy to have around. Over time, she and the Ingrams grew very close. It was a charming sort of bond, really. Lena trailed off then, seeming to lose herself in her own mind for a moment before continuing. "The Ingrams were always so sad. They'd lost their twin girls, and when they were ruled incompetent and unable to care for themselves, they were sent here. And it was really no mystery what happened to them. After a loss like that, hell, anyone would lose their minds." She wandered again into her own mind for a moment, seeming now to stare off into nothing as though she were watching a sad movie play in the distance. All they ever did was sit at that window and stare outside. Always together, holding hands. They would just stare. Frankie watched the slightest tint of tears form in the corner of the older woman's eyes. She wondered in that moment why she'd spoken of the Ingrams and this Natalie in a past tense, and a sudden sense of dread began to claw at her chest. In essence, she became like another daughter to them. And after a while, they seemed almost happy. It was a very sudden change in them, like there was something they had to look forward to. Lena sat there, staring off at nothing as she spoke. She didn't blink, just sat there staring, telling her story. Every day during her shift, she would sit with them at their window, talking and laughing. Normal chit-chat like old friends make. She would make her normal rounds and go straight back to the Ingrams, the The rest of us thought nothing of it. In fact, we were glad, in a way, though I'm ashamed to admit it, to have them off our hands. But they seemed happier. She looked down again, worrying at her fingernails the way she had a few moments earlier. One morning during my rounds, I noticed them sitting there as usual. I could see between the chairs that they were holding hands like they always did. I didn't bother them, I made my usual rounds. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. At that moment, the tears that clung so fiercely to her lashes fell like small drops of rain to her blouse. But still, she didn't blink. They were the last stop of my morning rounds. I always went to them at 10:10 a.m. But when I walked into the sitting room, it felt colder. I told them good morning like I always did, but I was used to them never responding. She paused again, taking in a deep, ragged breath. That day, I felt that something was wrong. And when I walked up beside them, I could see the stillness in them. They had the look of death, but they were smiling, eyes open, staring out that window, smiling. It was the only time I had ever seen them smile. Frankie's eyes grew wide. What she was hearing couldn't be true. Just last week, she had spoken to the Ingrams. They spoke to her. How could this be? We found out after the autopsies that Natalie had given them both a massive dose of potassium chloride. Lena wiped her eyes with a wadded up tissue she'd pulled from her pocket. Assisted suicide, she added coldly. They wanted to die. I guess we all knew they did. But it was Natalie that helped them. I suppose being as close to them as she had gotten made her feel somehow obligated. She stared at the tissue in her folded hands for a moment, swallowing hard before looking once more at Frankie. Natalie was arrested, and 7 weeks later, she hung herself in her jail cell, leaving behind a note explaining the whole thing. That was 8 years ago, Miss Welch. That night, Frankie sat in her tiny apartment, lit up like daytime, staring at nothing. Her mind, as it tended to do so often anymore, wandered over the day's events in disbelief. The Ingrams. Case closed. However confused she was, she had hope that wherever they were at rest now. She didn't know how much more of this she could take. Was she mad? Even though it all added up, she still had to wonder. Was she going to end up the way Redamona had, secluding herself away and hiding from the world? She watched as a shadow twisted and clawed its way across the far wall of her apartment, and however impossible it was for that to happen, she didn't even flinch. Let them come, she thought, and still didn't fully understand what the dark truly was. And she needed to. She needed to understand why she was able to see the things she saw. Things no one else could see. These black, twisted things that came from dark places and tormented her constantly. One day she would know. She was determined. The ghosts she saw, however, that was something different. Was it the shadows showing her these things? Was it simply another torment? She wasn't sure of anything anymore. It seemed like the only dead she wasn't seeing were the ones she wanted to see. Spokane, Washington, 11 years earlier. Closed casket. She kept hearing the term throughout the funeral home. At 17, she knew what the term meant, but that didn't mean she wanted to be reminded. The funeral itself was over, but the mass of people, some of whom she did not even recognize, still crowded the morose room as though it were a social gathering, some means to catch up on old times. She sat in a folding chair in the front row, staring at the casket. It was as though she were willing it to go away, willing it all to go back to the way it was, back to when everything, though never okay, was always okay. Her father stood in a far corner of the room talking to a minister. His eyes, red and swollen, seemed like glass peering out from two tired hollows. Dane stood quietly beside him, his hands folded and his eyes just as red and glassy as their father's. She didn't know anymore how to react. She felt a sense of betrayal mixed with shock, anger, and deep, heart-tearing despair. Her mother had been walking that night, as she did every night, but on this night, their neighbor had been drinking. It was raining, and the curve was dark. He shouldn't have been driving, but he was. He took the corner too fast and lost control of his Jeep, hitting her mother, trapping her beneath the vehicle and dragging her half a mile before overturning and tumbling another 40 feet, taking her along with it, before finally throwing her into a tree. The medical examiner said that she hadn't felt anything. After the initial impact, she died immediately. Frankie could see the lie clearly in his eyes. Somehow she just knew. Her mother felt all of it. She remembered a story her grandfather had told her once about a pair of lovebirds he watched for several years in the woods near her grandparents' home, just 50 miles away in Newport. He had told her that the birds were so much in love that they depended on one another for flight. Their bond was so strong that one bird became the other's wings. One day, the female bird died. Her mate, so distraught and heartbroken, took flight as high up as he could into the sky and plummeted back down to the ground without spreading his wings, dying on impact. His love for his mate was so immense that he refused to live without her. He would say that's how much her father loved her mother, and at the time it was both sad and romantic. The two beings could be so much in love that the very thought of life without one another was simply unbearable. It was only a week before she began to notice that her father had stopped eating. His eyes looked black and sunken in, desolate and hollow, with an emptiness that one might find on the face of a puppet someone had tossed into a corner. That's what he reminded her of. He had no energy and simply refused to leave the couch. He would just sit there. He didn't speak, he didn't sleep, he didn't eat. His features grew blank and gray, the ashen color climbing from his limbs all the way up to his deeply receding hairline. And no matter how she and Dame pleaded with him to eat, it was as though they weren't even there. Several weeks later, she and Dane were attending their father's funeral as well. They didn't have to say anything to one another. However unspoken, they each knew the other had accepted deep down that their father died the same night their mother had. His body just took time to follow suit. Indeed, the only dead she didn't see were the ones she truly wanted to. The shadow scurrying along her wall grabbed once more at her attention, forcing her to focus on it. She could see it as it tried to take shape in the blinding brightness of her small abode. Was it really there? How could it be? There was not room for a single shadow in this place. She even suffered through the uncomfortable heat that all the light created in such a small place, but still there it was. Just a small piece of blackness there on the wall, trying desperately to fight against the light and make itself whole. The curve was dark, she thought. Abby sat behind the reinforced glass, smacking her bright red gum and filing her nails as she had before. And still, Frankie felt her patience near fleeting the closer she came to the rude, pestiferous woman. But she held herself well in check, just as she had before. Looking above Abby, she could see the shadows in the corners form faces. The frightening things writhing and screeching, wide-mouthed and hollow-eyed, as though they were trapped inside the building's very structure, struggling to break free. Gaping mouths, spilling blackness and widening until the jaws split at the very corners, dangling open as though they would swallow her whole. She closed her eyes against it, hoping that when she opened them again, the horrid things would be gone. Would they ever go away? Abby, as always, was oblivious. Wrapped up obtusely in the small television that sat adjacent to her chair, her feet lazily propped up on the cabinet next to her desk. A moth flitted along the blinking fluorescent light, relentlessly banging itself against it like it would somehow make it inside. Miami's Clyde. The words were clear as day, as clear as the sound of the helmet banging against the wall. But Clyde was nowhere to be seen this time. She stood still for a moment, staring into the empty space, listening to Clyde's repetition. The more she looked, the more she noticed the dark scuff marks. They were faded and almost orange color against the lime green, fading to the piss yellow paint that peeled off the walls. A slight hint of what could have been blood descended from a splotch into a long, narrow trail down to the floor. Where was the strange, skinny man that wore the yellow helmet, that banged his head against the wall when he said his name? Where was Clyde? The blinking of the lights were more unsettling this time, not just because of the terrors heaving from above, but because with each blink she was in the dark, and every black millisecond brought with it some new twisted terror to plague her. Pitch, long-tongued scurriers darting this way and that, like a dance club beneath the strobe light. Abby, completely distracted by the small television, hadn't even noticed her come in, and didn't notice now as she stood at the counter in front of her, waiting for her attention. How she could focus on anything, even a TV, beneath the constant flickering of the fluorescent above her was beyond Frankie. She wondered then if Abby even knew she was there. Likely not. However, Frankie took notice of the superfluous keyring on the far side of the wall opposite Abby, and dismissed her last thought as a minor blessing. With a little wiggling and some small contortionist act, she would be able to snake her arm beneath the small paper pass at the bottom of the reinforced glass and take the ring, if she was quiet. Frankie's eyes were on Abby's back the whole time. Her arm got stuck for a moment, and she began to panic briefly before it slid the rest of the way through the pass. She bent her arm upward and reached until it hurt. The keys were just a hair's breadth out of her reach. She reached further, sliding more of her arm through the small opening until it felt like a vice on her shoulder. Stifling a whimper, she was able to clutch the keys. The small tinkling noise they made as they were closed in her hand made Frankie's blood go cold, and she froze there for a moment, petrified that she'd been caught. No movement from the obnoxious woman behind the desk. It was the first time Frankie was grateful that Abby was a lazy loafer rather than a hard-working do-all. As she began to pull her arm back through the glass, she noticed that the lights above had begun blinking at an alarming rate. It was almost as though they would burst or burn out any moment. Like the dark somehow knew what it was she was now planning to do. Frankie felt panic coming on once more. Just a bit more to go, and she was free of the receptionist desk. But as she felt the darkness closing in around her, she wondered now if her sudden stroke of genius was such a good thing after all. It was a burning feud inside herself, whether she should continue her quest for answers or run like hell from this place and never look back. Twisted, evil things. Each blink revealed hideousness marching its way ever closer to her. Its narrow black frame and long, meatless arms ending in thin, clawed hands that looked as though they could rip her very soul from her body. Deep sunken eyes that somehow stared right into her, pulling out her every fear. Flaking skin the color of fine charcoal seemed to tear away like ashes into a wind she could not see, as the thin strings of long pale hair blew from one side of its face to the other. She tried to focus on the task at hand, tried to maintain her composure as she struggled silently to pull the keys to her side of the receptionist's desk. She was completely terrified and unsure if she should finish this endeavor. Just a few more inches. she thought to herself. Each flicker brought the gnarled creature closer and closer, and she began to hear whispers echoing as though they were right next to her ear, louder and more distracting, all around her as though she were being surrounded by forces unseen. With each passing second, the whispers grew more intense, a blur of noise blaring in her mind with the ferocity beyond explanation. Shrouded voices speaking over one another in incomprehensible pleas that she could not understand, but terrified her nonetheless. All the while hearing the imperceptible Clyde introduce himself in a repetition near maddening. Each bang of the unseen helmet against the wall, each pulsating whisper, each flicker of the lights, each step the wraith-like creature took toward her brought her closer to meeting the insanity of it all with a scream as equally mad. But the end was in sight. With one final motion, her arm was freed of its reinforced trappings, and she slumped noiselessly to the floor with the keys in her hand, covering her ears to block the sounds, and pinching her eyes shut so tight it hurt, as though these actions would somehow bring her comfort. She sat there for only a moment before realizing that it was quiet. No banging of Clyde's helmet, no whispers. When she mustered the courage to open her eyes, the light was buzzing and steady, not flickering. Only the jutting rhythm of the moth banging loudly against it. And Abby, as obliviously ignorant of her surroundings as ever. Frankie took in a long breath, closed her eyes, and held it a moment before slowly allowing the much-needed air to escape. She realized now that she was on the right track, and something was trying to stop her. She leaned her head against the wall, just beneath the glass, staring up at the blinding fluorescent light, simply appreciating its steady glow. Was she really about to do this? It's too late to turn back now. She didn't stand up. She crawled to the door next to the receptionist's enclosure, just in case Abby decided to suddenly do her job. The door led to the dimly lit hallway, the one she dreaded. It took all the courage she could muster to turn the key and open the door, and even more to crawl through it and close it behind her. She leaned against it for a minute, trying to forget the scent of old urine and turpentine. This place was hell. Paint flakes from the walls stuck to the back of her hair and her shirt, making her skin itch and burn. Her hands, still sore and wrapped from her endeavor at the Ingrams' home, made crawling through this place even more difficult. And at that point she became paranoid about even touching the floor, then grew ridiculously concerned about what type of infection she may get from this disgusting place, running down a list of germs and bacteria in her mind. When she stood up, her head began to swim. Her heart was still racing, and even through the fear, she had an unexplainable determination to keep going. She couldn't believe she was doing this. She couldn't help but stare into the blackness down the corridor as though it would reach forth and take her. Her first step wasn't as difficult as she thought it would have been, but it gradually grew more difficult as she kept on. She was unpleasantly aware of the floor's texture beneath her feet, squishing and crunching with each step she took. She swallowed hard, balling her fists and holding them tight against her thighs as she slowly advanced at a painfully reluctant pace. Decrepit doors adorning rooms cloaked in darkness lined both sides of the hall. They seemed empty, though she could feel eyes on her with each door she passed. Small windows the size of dinner plates showed no sign of life inside the tiny rooms, but she dared not move any closer to them to peer in. A loud bang caused her to start and jump, gasping for breath. It came from one of the rooms just ahead of her. "My name is Clyde," she heard. "My name is Clyde." She couldn't take much more of this. Whoever or whatever Clyde was seemed to be following her. The closer she came, the clearer she could see light flickering on and off in the room, emitting the noise. Each time the flickering lit the room, a presence would appear in the small window. She didn't have to wonder who it was or what it was anymore. Every glint revealed the face of a man. Blood ran down both sides of his head and face, trailing along thin lines down his neck and into his white shirt. His yellow-orange helmet was badly dented and scuffed on either side. His face was almost childlike, though he looked to be nearly 30. She felt a sense of innocence from him. His palm pressed against the window as he looked to her and back to his hand in an eager gesture that revealed more of his nature than she expected. His smile was crooked and a stream of drool ran from the corner of his mouth and down his chin, giving her the sudden urge to gently wipe it away. His eyes, big and full of wonder, like those of a young boy, coaxed her, darting from her to his outstretched hand and back again, over and over. Though she was hesitant, she found her arm reaching out, her hand opening to fit against the glass in a gesture to somehow meet the palm on the other side. A motherly sense seemed to wash over her, an unbearable urge to hold this man, to comfort him and tell him everything would be okay, gripped at her until her throat hurt. Did it show on her face, she wondered. When her hand finally met the glass, she was completely taken back by what would happen. In a flash of white, she found herself huddled in a gray haze. The buzzing of people all around her bringing a ringing to her ears that seemed to grow louder and louder. She felt like a small child now, helpless in her surroundings. But she recognized her surroundings. However gray and muddled her environment now was, it still revealed the same building she had been in only a moment ago. But it was new, almost pristine. The droning noise in her head made by the people around her was near deafening. One man stood only inches away, swaying back and forth in front of a window. Another, rather disheveled looking, sat at a table not far away, eating playing cards. There were so many people here. People whose minds did not seem to be their own. She didn't belong here. Two orderlies stood in a far corner smoking cigarettes while a medley of cartoons played on a TV above her. She began to bang her head against the wall she crouched against, trying to make the noise subside. She didn't like it here, and she began to wish she was safe at home. It was too loud here. She covered her ears, but it didn't help. So loud. Every noise was its own torment to her. What was happening? She began to panic. She needed something familiar to keep with her, something she knew. My name is Clyde. Reality hit her like a ton of bricks. She jumped back. She stared into the childlike eyes of the ghost holding his hand against the small pane of glass, still beckoning to her. Did she dare? It was such a real experience. She found herself frightened and very reluctant to touch the glass where Clyde's hand pressed eagerly against the other side. What happened to you? She whispered, near sobbing. The apparition looked down for a moment before leaning his head on the glass, seemingly plagued by his memories. His hand still firmly in place, he opened his eyes and looked at her. It was a very different look in his eyes now. Fear, loathing, pain. He set his glance once more to his hand, and again to her. He needed to share it with her. He needed someone to know. And she hesitated only a moment before summoning the courage from deep within her to touch the glass once more. Like a shot, she found herself crouched by a wall again, but this wall was different, somehow colder than the last. She found herself in the dark, alone and terrified. It was a new kind of fear, a new kind of panic. Not just of the dark around her, but something else. She felt the tears hot on her face as she whimpered and cried. Her cuticles burned and stung from anxiously biting her nails down to the bed. This was a terror she had never known before. But it wasn't because of the room she found herself in. No, she knew that fear, but this fear was of being let out of the room. But why? Again, she began to bang her head against the wall. It didn't hurt like before, as something cushioned the blow now, soft and somehow comforting to her. My name is Clyde. She clung to this sentence as though she might forget. My name is Clyde. Footsteps, distant and heavy, began descending down the corridor outside. She froze then, gripped in sheer terror of what was to come. The cadence was uneven but steady in pace. 2 of them were coming. Her panic grew with each approaching thud of the orderly's boots. Why was she so afraid? She gritted her teeth against the sound of a key sliding into the lock on the door. Light spilled into the black room when it was swung open, blinding her for a moment. Laughter emanated from the hallway as the 2 orderlies shared a story of sexual conquest. A horrid sound, their laughter, so near evil that she had to wonder if the devil himself were embodied there. When the figures emerged from the corridor, she stared up at her 2 worst nightmares. Rogers, a pot-bellied drunk that was even too arrogant to hide his alcoholism at work. And Norton, a lifelong bully that applied for a position here because he simply couldn't resist the cornucopia that provided his favorite pastime, the utter torment of the weak and helpless. All right, dummy, let's go. Time for your therapy, Rogers said mockingly. He and Norton began to both chuckle at the word therapy. She didn't move, just stared up at them frozen, her knees tucked into her arms, terrified of what was to come. Norton smacked the side of the helmet, sending her head slamming against the wall so hard it made her neck hurt. Come on, brainless, let's go. We ain't got all damn day. She let out a protest at the abuse and was met with a hard kick to her thigh from Norton and another smack from Rogers. "Get up," Rogers demanded. She felt helpless, weak and afraid. She slid upward against the wall slowly, flinching and shielding herself from more blows she feared would fall. "I want my mommy," she managed in a small, shaking voice. They burst out then in bellowing laughter. 30 years old and he wants his fucking mommy," Norton said, near doubling over with laughter. Rogers, still in a chuckle, slammed her against the wall with one hand, began slapping the side of her head with the other. "Your mommy don't want you, idiot boy. Your ass belongs to us now. Get used to it." He then flung her toward the open door with enough force that she almost fell to the ground. She began to sob uncontrollably as she made her way down the long corridor. Dread filled her every sense as the two men guided her further and further along. They began to chortle at her fear and sorrow. The more she wept, the more they seemed to enjoy themselves. They stopped abruptly at the door marked "Staff Only" in bright red letters. Rogers opened it, and Norton pushed her through so hard she stumbled, falling down a flight of stairs leading to the basement. "So you know that hot little piece of ass in the crisis ward?" she heard Norton say in a near-muddled voice. Her head felt like it was swimming. The fall down the stairs made her feel like she was under water. She wanted to sleep. "You mean, forever virgin, nun in street clothes, the cutter. Shit, what's her name?" Rogers rubbed his forehead as though he would be able to find what he was looking for there. They descended the stairs in strides as they carried on their vulgar conversation. She felt like she shouldn't hear what they were saying, as though hearing it would make her like they were. Bad. "Fuck, I don't know her name," Norton replied with a chuckle. They stopped on the bottom step, just short of her to finish their conversation. "I know she ain't a virgin now, though." Norton laughed when he said it, as though he were extraordinarily proud of himself. "You fucked her?" "Oh man, tell me you fucked her," Rogers said in a tone nearing excitement. She covered her ears, but it didn't help. She could still hear them, as though she hadn't moved her hands at all. "Well, hell yes, I did, and boy, let me tell you, that precious little pink was sweet. Mm. She fought for a while, but she knew she wanted it. You know, I'm gonna be having fun with that for a long time." Norton gloated, beaming with pride. She found herself disgusted. She was nauseated by these two repulsive animals. Rogers bellowed in laughter, slapped Norton on the back, congratulating him on his conquest. He then put his hands on his hips and stared down at her, cocking his head to the side. "Well, let's take this dummy to get zapped and move on, shall we?" They each took a firm, painful grip on her arms and lifted her to her feet. Her head ached and throbbed, and she could feel something hot and sticky running out of her helmet and down the side of her face. It didn't take long before her dread increased tenfold. They opened a door and walked through, picking her up and laying her down on a cold steel gurney. "Here's your victim," Rogers said jokingly. A woman in a nurse's uniform stepped forward and looked down at her with loving, comforting eyes. Her vision blurred and faded in and out. She did not feel threatened by this woman. The nurse's look then changed. Comfort and safety turned suddenly to concern. "Why is he bleeding?" she asked as Rogers and Norton stood cross-armed on the other side of the room talking. Rogers looked at her blankly, and before he could speak, Norton interjected. The jackass slams his fucking head into walls. What do you think is going to happen? She narrowed her eyes and spoke in a gentle but assertive tone then. Around me, you will watch your language. Norton and Rogers both laughed then and went back to their conversation. She removed the helmet gently and placed it on the table beside her. When she did, she saw the massive wounds caused by the orderly's abuse. Blood crusted in the patient's hair and seeped in small pools onto the steel table. She stood shocked and shook her head. She quickly moved to the phone on her right and put it to her ear, but before she could even push the button for the infirmary, Norton was at her back. He pulled out a small pocket knife and placed it firm against her throat, pressing his cheek against hers and whispering gruffly, "Just do what you do, pretty girl. No need for all that, just do what you do. Trust me, it's a lot better than the alternative," he said smugly before nibbling her earlobe. She stared down at her with remorse and pity, sorry for what she was being forced to do. "It'll kill him," she whispered to the man holding the knife against her throat. Norton was rubbing his face against her now, smelling her and gently licking at her ear. "So," he replied, "do what I said and I'll leave you alone. Understand?" He pressed the knife against her a bit harder and she gasped, "Okay! Okay, I'll do it." She whimpered. Norton then reached with his free hand and unplugged the service phone at both ends, wrapping the cord around his hand. "Then we don't have a problem, do we, pretty girl?" he whispered in her ear before slithering his tongue in it and releasing her. She looked like she might vomit. He crossed the room and nonchalantly resumed his conversation with Rogers as though nothing had transpired. Frankie stared up at the nurse in terror, unable to move. Tears formed in the woman's eyes. She began to strap Frankie to the table, each restraint uniformly buckled down. The buzzing of a machine clicked on, a familiar sound, and yet not. Gradually the humming became louder, like an electrical song meant to lull one into sleep. Nausea swept over her in waves as her vision blurred and dimmed unsteadily. The nurse reappeared with a small rod wrapped generously in white cloth, placing it firmly between Frankie's teeth. Blinking slowly, she could only stare up at the nurse and plead with her eyes alone that she not do this. She stared down at her for a moment, stroking her hair. Her tears fell onto Frankie's forehead in small drops of complete and unfathomable sadness. "I am so sorry," she wept. "Please, please forgive me." It was the last thing she heard before cold, wet metal was placed against her temples. Lightning shot through her, and then there was only darkness. She woke in the dark. Pain shot through her like thunder. It was almost impossible to move. She was so weak, so tired. "Let me out. Let me out," she whispered so low it was near inaudible. It was the only way to get home, the only way to get free. She had to get out. If she stayed in this dark room alone, she knew she would die. The tiny light emitting from the small window of the door was her only guide to salvation. She needed help. Her head was exploding with pain, and she could feel blood trickling down her face and neck. If she could just get out, she would be okay. She'd be free, she'd be saved. The helmet felt so heavy now as she crawled towards the door. It felt like it weighed her down. Fatigue was beginning to overtake her. She made it across the tiny room to the door, only to find it was locked. She could not get out. She slumped against the metal and began to shout as loudly as she could, "Help me!" But no matter how she screamed and shouted, there was no response. "Help me! Let me out! I need help! Please!" Nothing. Her whole body was racked with pain. So much pain. She did not want to move, fearing if she did, her bones would simply turn to dust. "Oh, my mommy." It was the last words she could muster before blackness took her. Frankie jumped back from the door and stared at Clyde, her tears no longer waiting as they ran like a river down her face. She slid down the wall across from him and wept uncontrollably. How this poor man had suffered. How could anyone be so cruel? She felt sorrow, rage, and unbearable hatred welling up inside of her. Now she knew why he had shown her this. It seemed like hours had passed before she regained control of herself and stood back up. Clyde was still there, blinking on and off with the lights. His hand no longer pressed against the glass, but now he simply looked at her with those sweet, innocent eyes. She stepped forward and looked at him gently, her eyes wet and red from sobbing. "Let me out. Let me out." It went through her thoughts in a constant whisper. She slid the key into the lock on his door and opened it. The tall, thin man stepped uncertainly out of the small room, looking around him in wonder. A halo of light surrounding him, and he smiled. The most precious smile she had ever seen, like a lost child coming home. He turned to her then and looked lovingly into her eyes, taking tiny, unsure steps toward her. Her tears fell once more as she placed her hands on his face, gently holding it. He was really there. She felt him, his skin smooth as a child's and warm beneath her touch. "Go home," she whispered. He bent down and pressed his forehead against hers in a gesture that could only be described as an embrace. His eyes closed and a tear fell down his cheek. "My name is Clyde." He turned then and began to walk away. His awkward gait had a sense of certainty to it now, as though he knew where to go. She watched with mixed emotions as he disappeared in a flash of brilliant light.